The Atlantic Ocean has a way of keeping secrets. For centuries, ships have crossed it carrying cargo, passengers, and entire lives between continents. Some of those ships arrived exactly where they were supposed to. Others simply vanished. But every now and then, the ocean returns something strange. On the afternoon of December 5, 1872, a merchant vessel sailing through the cold waters between Portugal and the Azores noticed something unusual drifting on the horizon. At first, it looked like any other ship. Its sails were partly raised. The hull sat steady in the water. But as the distance closed, something felt wrong. The ship moved oddly, yawing from side to side as if no one were controlling it. No one stood at the wheel. No one walked the deck. There was no movement at all. The ship appeared to be sailing itself. When sailors finally climbed aboard, they discovered something deeply unsettling. The vessel was completely empty. Not damaged. Not burned. Not sinking. Just abandoned. The ship's name was Mary Celeste. And every single person who had been aboard her had vanished. 10 people had boarded that ship in New York weeks earlier. A captain. A crew. A mother. A 2-year-old child. By the time the ship was discovered drifting in the Atlantic, they were all gone. No bodies. No wreckage. No explanation. And nearly a century and a half later, the mystery of what happened on the Mary Celeste remains one of the most famous unsolved stories in maritime history. To understand how this mystery began, we have to go back a few weeks earlier. November 7, 1872. New York Harbor was crowded with ships preparing to cross the Atlantic. Merchant vessels moved constantly between the United States and Europe, carrying everything from textiles to food to industrial chemicals. Among them sat a brigantine named Mary Celeste. She was not particularly large. Just over 100 feet long, built in Nova Scotia in 1861. Over the years she had changed owners several times and experienced a few minor mishaps at sea. Nothing unusual for a working cargo ship of that era. But the man now commanding the vessel had an excellent reputation. Captain Benjamin Briggs was 37 years old and widely respected among sailors who knew him. He was known as calm, careful, and deeply religious. Fellow captains described him as disciplined and trustworthy. This voyage was supposed to be routine. The Mary Celeste was scheduled to carry a cargo of 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol across the Atlantic to Genoa, Italy. But Captain Briggs made a personal decision that would later make the story even more haunting. Instead of leaving his family behind, he brought them with him. His wife, Sarah Briggs, boarded the ship. So did their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia. Alongside them were 7 crew members, experienced sailors, most of them German immigrants who had worked on merchant ships before. 10 people in total. Before departing New York, Captain Briggs wrote a letter to his mother. In it, he described the crew as capable and the voyage as promising. Everything about the trip appeared normal. The ship was seaworthy. The weather was favorable. Nothing suggested that within a month, the Mary Celeste would become one of the most mysterious ships in history. 8 days after the Mary Celeste left New York, another merchant vessel departed from the same harbor. Its name was Dei Gratia. The captain of the Dei Gratia was David Morehouse. Interestingly, Captain Morehouse actually knew Benjamin Briggs. The 2 men had spoken briefly before their ships departed, though they were not close friends. Both ships headed east across the Atlantic. But they never sailed together. For several weeks, the Mary Celeste continued its journey toward Europe. Then, on December 5, sailors aboard the Dei Gratia spotted a ship behaving strangely in the distance. It was about 400 miles east of the Azores. Through a telescope, Captain Morehouse studied the vessel. The sails looked awkwardly set. The ship drifted irregularly. And something else immediately stood out. No one was on deck. That alone was unusual. Ships crossing the Atlantic always had someone visible, adjusting sails, standing watch, steering the vessel. But this ship looked deserted. Captain Morehouse ordered a small boarding party to investigate. As they approached the vessel in a small boat, the name became visible on the stern. Mary Celeste. The sailors climbed aboard cautiously. What they found was deeply unsettling. The ship was completely empty. Cabins were undisturbed. Personal belongings remained neatly stored. Clothing hung where it had been left. In the galley, food supplies were still present. Nothing appeared looted. Nothing appeared destroyed. But no one was there. The crew searched the entire ship. Deck, cabins, cargo hold, every corner. No bodies. No crew. No passengers. The only clear sign that the crew had left voluntarily was the missing lifeboat. The ship had carried one small boat attached to the side. Now it was gone. That meant the crew had likely abandoned the ship intentionally. But why? Because everything else suggested the ship was still perfectly capable of sailing. The cargo, those 1,701 barrels of alcohol, remained in the hold. The hull was intact. The ship was still seaworthy. Even more confusing, the vessel still carried months of food and water. There was no obvious reason to abandon it. But the crew had taken a few specific items. Captain Briggs' sextant and chronometer, essential navigation tools, were missing. That suggested the captain had planned to navigate somewhere after leaving the ship. Which raised an even stranger question. Where were they going? Captain Morehouse now faced a difficult choice. An abandoned ship at sea represented a valuable opportunity. Under maritime law, salvaging a drifting vessel could lead to a significant reward. But first, the Mary Celeste needed to reach port. So a small group of sailors from the Dei Gratia boarded the empty ship and slowly sailed it toward Gibraltar. Weeks later, the mysterious vessel arrived there. And that is when the real investigation began. Authorities in Gibraltar quickly realized they were dealing with a deeply unusual case. The investigation was led by Frederick Solly Flood, the Attorney General of Gibraltar. Flood initially suspected something far more sinister. Perhaps the crew of the Dei Gratia had murdered the passengers of the Mary Celeste. Perhaps the entire scene had been staged to claim salvage money. But the more investigators examined the ship, the less that theory made sense. There were no signs of violence. No blood. No hidden bodies. No evidence of a struggle anywhere on board. The cargo was untouched. Valuable personal belongings remained exactly where they had been left. Even the crew's pipes and clothing were still in their cabins. It did not look like a crime scene. It looked like a ship whose crew had simply walked away. Investigators examined the ship's logbook. The last recorded entry was dated November 25, 1872. According to the log, the Mary Celeste had been sailing near the Azores at that time. But when it was discovered on December 5, the ship was hundreds of miles away from that position. Which meant the vessel had drifted unattended for over a week. Investigators also discovered a few unusual details. Some of the sails were damaged. There was about 3.5 feet of water in the bilge, the lowest part of the ship. But for a cargo vessel crossing the Atlantic, that amount of water was not particularly dangerous. Ships often carried some water in the bilge. In other words, nothing investigators found clearly explained why Captain Briggs would abandon a seaworthy ship. And that decision would have been extremely unusual. Sailors of the 19th century understood something very well. A large ship, even a damaged one, was almost always safer than a small lifeboat in the open ocean. Yet somehow, 10 people had left the Mary Celeste, including a mother and her small child. And they were never seen again. Over the decades that followed, countless explanations emerged. Some were grounded in reality. Others drifted into legend. One of the earliest ideas was piracy. But pirates typically stole cargo and valuables. On the Mary Celeste, nothing had been taken. Another theory suggested mutiny. Perhaps the crew had turned against Captain Briggs. But again, there was no evidence of conflict or violence. Captain Briggs was also widely respected by other sailors. A mutiny seemed unlikely. Then there were the more imaginative explanations. Sea monsters, alien encounters, paranormal forces. The Mary Celeste gradually earned a reputation as a ghost ship. But historians tend to focus on explanations that fit the known facts. And one of the most widely discussed theories involves the ship's cargo. Those 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol were volatile. Alcohol produces highly flammable vapors. If vapors leaked into the cargo hold, they could create the risk of an explosion. Over time, researchers discovered something interesting about the cargo. When the barrels were inspected years later, 9 of them were empty. These particular barrels had been made from red oak, which is more porous than white oak, meaning alcohol vapors could have slowly leaked into the ship's interior. If Captain Briggs smelled strong alcohol fumes inside the ship, he may have feared the worst. Imagine the situation. A cargo hold filled with flammable vapors. The possibility of a sudden explosion. A ship carrying your wife and small child. If that fear arose, abandoning the ship temporarily might have seemed like the safest choice. Some historians believe Captain Briggs may have ordered everyone into the lifeboat while the ship aired out. The lifeboat could have been tied to the ship with a rope, close enough to return once the danger passed. But if that rope snapped, everything would change. A sudden gust of wind, a strong wave, the drifting Mary Celeste slowly pulling away. Within minutes, the lifeboat could be separated from the ship, leaving 10 people stranded in a small boat in the open Atlantic. And the Atlantic is enormous. Storms can appear quickly. Waves can grow violent. Navigation without proper equipment becomes nearly impossible. If the crew lost sight of the Mary Celeste, finding it again would have been extremely unlikely. Somewhere on that voyage, Captain Benjamin Briggs made a decision. A decision that led 10 people to step off a ship that was still capable of reaching safety. What happened after that moment? We may never know. Because once the crew left the Mary Celeste, the story vanished with them. And the Atlantic Ocean kept the rest.